Located at the crossroads between Asia, Africa and Europe, Jordan is a country made interesting primarily, if not almost entirely, by its geopolitics. The Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, as it is officially called, is not just an oasis of stability, as many analysts routinely call the country for its distinct lack of serious violence for the last 50 years or so, but it's a country that can make any rigid ideologue scratch his head. Jordan is an Arab country with Islam as the state religion and running somewhat on Sharia law. Yet in Jordan, alcohol is widely available, free speech protections are far superior to those of Germany or Sweden, and the Christian minority enjoys rights and privileges that even some nominally Christian countries don't have anymore. For instance, one offended individual can't get the state to silence the bells of a church in Jordan, but it is totally possible in the United Kingdom. Although a founder of the Arab League and of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the kingdom routinely acts either as a separate entity or as a middleman between the various factions of its area. In addition to its geopolitics, the economics of Jordan is also an interesting facet of this country, being essentially the only country in the area, except Israel, where the economy is truly diversified and where skilled labor is the norm rather than the exception. Welcome to Jordan. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. So in the next hour, I will try to cram as much information as possible about Jordan, a country that is so atypical politically that it may well be in a league of its own. Neighboring Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Israel, and the disputed territory of West Bank, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is unlike any of its neighbors. It has, of course, plenty of things in common with all of its neighbors, but not enough with any of them to make it alike any of its regional neighbors. The country is ethnically similar with Saudi Arabia, economically similar with Israel, but with plenty of twists that are nowhere else to be found in the area, civilizationally similar with earlier pre-Saddam Hussein Iraq, a similarity due to the fact that until 1958 Iraq was also ruled by a Hashemite dynasty, and geopolitically, well, Jordan is not similar to anyone overall, though it does have a lot in common with Egypt, Israel, the United States, and sometimes the European Union in terms of geopolitics. So in this video, we will look at the following aspects: geopolitics, economics, politics, civilization and society, where we'll look at how living in Jordan actually is in practice, beyond statistics or touristy views, and hopefully at the end we'll be drawing some conclusions and maybe even make some modest predictions. As usual, I don't claim to know everything about everything, nor is there any pretense that this video will cover all of the details and facets of this tremendously interesting country for any political researcher. So let's start with the most difficult topic: geopolitics. The topic regarding the geopolitics of Jordan is made complicated because the underlying mentality, or ideology if you like, driving the geopolitical decisions of the country is, and has been for 30 years now, quite different from all the other actors in the region. While most actors in the region have relatively simple geopolitical concerns, such as either stability of the regime, such as the case of Saudi Arabia, regional power plays, the case of Iran, or the continual existence, the case of Israel, Jordan has more fluid geopolitical concerns. For starters, this is due to the geo part of geopolitics, Jordan being now, as always in history, located on most relevant trade routes that connect Asia with Africa and Asia, specifically the Middle East, with the European civilization. Of course, some of this status is shared as well by Syria, Israel and Lebanon, but Jordan takes the lion's share of these concerns by virtue of its geography, but also due to the political events of the last 30 years, which strengthened Jordan's role as the de facto stable buffer zone between three big continents. It may sound like a blessing, and sometimes indeed it is, but it's also a very tough spot to be in, which is what makes Jordan interesting because it has held its ground remarkably well. The way this was achieved, though, is through a nightmarish web of geopolitical stances that make any analyst's head spin. Let me give you an example. Jordan is part of the Non-Aligned movement, the geopolitical organization started by the Yugoslav communist dictator Josip Broz Tito with the ideological guidance of the Slovenian Marxist Edvard Kardelj. I explained more about that in the past video called The Geopolitics of Slovenia. Most of the members of the Non-Aligned movement most of the time were and are socialists and communists, yet Jordan isn't and wasn't. The point of the non-aligned movement was, during the Cold War, to be the geopolitical alliance of the countries that were neither affiliated with the West nor with the USSR. As a side note, the countries of the non-aligned movement were the ones referred to as the Third World before 1991. Yet even as it's part of this organization, Jordan is a major non-NATO ally, which in practical reality means basically being in NATO without being in NATO. Other countries that enjoy this status are Australia, New Zealand, Israel, South Korea, Egypt, Argentina, Morocco, Thailand, Taiwan, and a few others. Notice that all of these have few things in common except for their de facto pro-Western geopolitical stance. In fact, the existence of the major non-NATO allies goes to show that civilizational affinity is far from being the only important factor in geopolitics. Does your head spin yet? If not, let's look at Jordan's regional geopolitics. As mentioned earlier, the kingdom is a founding member of the Arab League and of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, yet at the same time part of the European Neighborhood Policy Initiative, under which Jordan made significant changes to its economics that pissed off their main partner in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, namely Pakistan. The kingdom's relations with Pakistan are another example on how often perceived cultural affinity doesn't exactly matter. And in Jordan's case, it doesn't matter because economics is a lot more important to the country's elite than pleasing those who profess to be the country's cultural allies. Well, that and the fact that Jordan's elite is European educated and not particularly interested in too much contact with those whose views they regard as too repressive. Now, the word repressive here needs to be understood in the context of the elites, because if there's one thing Jordan has in common with all the other Arab states, is the fact that those serious matters have essentially zero input from the average people, everything being decided entirely by the elites. Now, this may sound like a bad thing from a European or a Western perspective, and it is indeed one of the topics that generates plenty of whining from Brussels, but if the task is to keep a mostly Arab place as an oasis of stability at the crossroads of three of the world's continents, it's actually preferable not to have these things subjected to the passions of the public. More on those passions later in the video when we get to politics. The point is that whatever the public may believe, the elite that actually decides these things is largely liberal by Arab Islamic standards, an aspect which is made very clear in all institutions where the elite is the primary deciding factor, and less clear in institutions that have some sort of democratic control, such as the House of Representatives or certain religious tribunals. And yes, there are religious tribunals in Jordan with limited authority over a tiny portion of family law, but unlike, let's say, Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, the law recognizes Christian tribunals as well, making Jordan one of the last places on earth where Christian tribunals are actually a thing. This should come as no surprise, since Jordan is the home of some of the oldest Christian communities in the world, some of them dating as far back as the 1st century AD. And to make the head spinning complete, Jordan got to be lauded by international leftists for taking in roughly 1.5 million refugees from Syria, but then everyone went quiet when the state decided that almost none of them are to be allowed to roam free in the country, but rather stay in designated camps until it's safe for them to go back. As of November 2018, just a month after I took this footage, the repatriation process has begun. As a principle, Jordan is welcoming to almost anyone as long as you can support yourself and don't disturb the peace, a policy which used to characterize Europe not so long ago. Alright, since I mentioned the welcoming part, it's a good moment to shift the focus to economics. As mentioned earlier, Jordan is different from the other Arab states in economics, resembling Israel or some countries of Europe rather than its other neighbors. Basically, while in this region it is common to see the economy of a state mostly relying on oil, Jordan has a truly diverse economy by the region's standards, and this is in part because the country's natural resources are less generous than those of Saudi Arabia, for instance, and the country is pretty small, which makes the human capital a much more valuable resource. Officially, there are 10 million people in Jordan, but that doesn't include many of the gray area and outright illegal immigrants. Also, the population in Jordan skews younger than the area's average, which means that the size of the reliable labor force is smaller than one would expect. All of these constraints make Jordan the smallest economy in the area, and as such, the road to prosperity had and has to include free trade. And it does. Jordan is the most open economy in its area, with free trade agreements with almost everyone. It would be easier to list the places with which Jordan does not have a free trade agreement, and that list is pretty interesting. Jordan does not have a free trade agreement with neighboring Iraq, with Pakistan, with the Gulf states, with Lebanon, and with the so-called Palestinian Authority. From an economics perspective, Jordan doesn't seem to be looking for prosperity and lucrative commerce nearby, but rather far away in Malaysia, Singapore, Turkey, Tunisia, Algeria, the European Union, the United States, Canada, Morocco, and Syria. It should be noted that Jordan is the first Arab country to get a free trade deal with the United States. Usually, when someone in this area goes this route, troubles emerge unless the place becomes a knowledge-based economy. And this is what Jordan is trying to become, always leading the pack amongst the countries known as emerging knowledge economies. Because it doesn't have crude oil reserves and the shale oil reserves are hard to exploit for the time being, Jordan has had to focus on other activities to bring prosperity to its people. Up until 2003, Jordan relied on Iraq for oil, but since the fall of Saddam Hussein, that has become rather difficult. But since 1999, with the ascension to the throne of the current king, the country has been able to reform its economy at a pace fast enough to avoid the troubles that shook other Middle Eastern/Arab countries, but also at a pace slow enough to avoid disrupting the peace. Notice that I keep using this phrase, disrupting the peace, which is an aspect with which the elite is and has been deeply concerned, to the point that economic growth was relegated to secondary status in favor of maintaining the peace. I don't know whether it is a good idea or not, and I would argue that nobody knows for sure just yet, but the kingdom's elites preferred to divert resources from other investments just to keep the refugee crisis in check and away from the rest of the Jordanian society, which led to a slowdown in economic growth and also an accumulation of debt, especially on the public coffers. While 10 years ago the debt-to-GDP ratio in the kingdom was 50%, by 2017 it had reached 94%, with the refugee crisis costing the government as much as 25% of the government's revenue and 6% of the GDP. The official Western narrative is that those costs are offset by foreign aid, yet the reality on the ground shows that only a third of those costs are covered by foreign aid, which anyway comes with huge delays, thus further eroding the degree of help that the international community offered to give to Jordan for being the most quiet and efficient manager of the refugee crisis. Although the economic reforms adopted in the last 20 years have indeed started to pay off, Jordan's standard of living increasing substantially and the country getting better in almost every indicator, the slow pace of foreign direct investment has maintained the state as disproportionately the main player. Now, that wouldn't have been such a tragedy if not for the regional instability that I mentioned earlier, which drove up the costs for the state to the point that now they have to go through an austerity program in order to avoid the debt-to-GDP ratio from going over 100%. The biggest success so far appears to be the freezing of further indebting. Preliminary numbers for 2018 show that the country's debt-to-GDP ratio remained narrowly under 95%, with a plan to get it as low as 77% by the end of 2021. biggest economic sectors of the country are the medical sector, including medical tourism, but also medicine packaging and manufacturing, the mining sector with a thriving industry in chemical fertilizer, the textile sector, gold, jewelry and other precious metal, optical fiber cables manufacturing, and, of course, tourism. The potential for things to get better is clear, provided that the country will succeed in building its railway system, which for now is basically non-existent, the only railway being one built during the Ottoman era, which is mainly used for light cargo. The main obstacle, outside of the fact that many regional players just can't seem to be able to maintain stability, is the dearth of fresh water, which still leads to electricity shortages in the kingdom or to unusually high prices even by the region's standards. If I were to speculate, some of this would get better if the country would improve its ease of doing business index, which for now stands quite abysmal, Jordan being ranked 104th in the world. Better than all of its neighbors except Israel and better than the region's average, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. One cannot talk about the economics of Jordan without talking a bit about Aqaba, a town of just 100,000 people that might as well not be in Jordan. Sadly, I didn't have enough money to go to Aqaba as well and show you what I'm talking about, so the details will have to be postponed for the next time I'll be in the region. But the short story is this. Aqaba is a special economic zone at the southern tip of the kingdom, right between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and on the shores of the Red Sea and close to the Suez Canal. In Aqaba, there is a 5% flat tax on most economic activities, no tariffs on imported goods, no currency restrictions, and no property taxes for corporate land, and the labor restrictions are far less onerous than the rest of the kingdom. Set out in 2001 with the goal of bringing $6 billion in foreign investment by 2020, Aqaba had already surpassed that goal in just 5 years and going way into the 20 billion territory by mid-2018. Just a bit over a week ago, businesses have pledged another $15 billion by 2025, prompting government officials to tout the expansion of the model in other parts of the kingdom as well. It is really quite unfortunate that I can't show you more of the place because Aqaba is run almost entirely by private companies and it's basically a Hong Kong but without commies threatening it and in the Middle East. So, to sum up on economics, if one is looking for investment opportunities in the Middle East, Jordan's IT&C sector, as well as the mining and construction industry, are something one should look into. For low taxes and faster pace of business growth, Aqaba is where one should start one's search. English is the standard lingua franca in the business, the regulatory framework is friendlier than in Israel, and the level of corruption is slightly higher than in Israel, but low compared to the region's average. Alright, now let's get to politics. Well, at the first glance, Jordan is a dictatorship, but a friendly one. In reality, the place is quite weird for a dictatorship, due to the fact that the level of censorship is a lot lower than what is sadly the norm nowadays in Europe. For instance, in Jordan, holding a public meeting does not require permission from anyone. Such thing would be unimaginable almost anywhere in Europe, where having a license to speak is the absolute norm. International organizations such as the far-left agitprop tools Human Rights Watch still maintains harsh criticism on Jordan because in 2015 someone proposed an amendment that would criminalize quote-unquote hate speech and speech that would quote disturb the peace unquote. It doesn't matter that the amendment didn't pass or that most of the country's elite was against it. And of course, the same Human Rights Watch has nothing to say about the already existent legal abuses against freedom of expression that are endemic in Western Europe. It's almost as if there's a double standard or something. Now, that doesn't mean the politics of Jordan is trouble-free, mind you. For instance, over the last 3 years, the country has seen a rise in the usual suspects, namely Marxists and Islamists, so far kept at bay precisely because the passions of the radicals were intentionally excluded from the political process. But with international pressure to become more quote-unquote democratic, such problems are bound to increase in the foreseeable future unless the elite has the foresight not to rush things through. Remember what I said in geopolitics, most of the important things are decided by the elite and not via democracy. The system of governance in Jordan illustrates this quite well. The country is a unitary constitutional monarchy, but the king retains quite a few executive powers. It's a mixture between an absolutist monarchy and an entirely parliamentary system. The parliament is bicameral. The House of Representatives is voted through party list proportional representation in 23 constituencies for a 4-year term, and the Senate is entirely appointed by the king. The House also has in its rules affirmative action type of policies, such as a minimum quota for women, for Christians, and for Chechens. In the last election in 2016, the quotas ended up not being used because the results surpassed the thresholds anyway. The parliament acts as a check on the king's power, having the ability to override a royal veto, although by a 2/3 majority, and can also dismiss the government via a simple majority. This is not just the theory. What I just said happened in practice several times in the last 5 years, last time in June 2018, a few months before I taped these images. In June 2018, Jordanians took advantage of the permissionless approach to public protests and insisted on the resignation of the previous quasi-leftist government. The protests triggered parliamentary action, which led to the dismissal of the previous government and the king appointing what seems to be a more capitalist or classical liberal cabinet led by the former World Bank economist Omar Razaz. The good news is that the controversy was over attempted increases in the personal income tax, a sign that the public is woke on the issue of the dangers of the maximal state. Personal income tax is a progressive system, with 5% being the tax rate for the first 5,000 Jordanian dinars and going as high as 30% for amounts over 1 million dinars, a level which the Jordanian public considers to be already way too high. And I can't disagree with them at all. Sure, for those accustomed with the tyranny of the excessive taxation and the obese, debt-ridden maximal state in progressive Europe, these taxation levels may seem small, but the Jordanian public appears to be smarter than that and unwilling to be robbed even more. Now, if this state of mind were to continue, that would be great. I don't know if it will, but the existence and the continual toleration of Marxist parties in the kingdom is a serious concern for sure. The intention of the current king is to turn the politics of the country into one that is more parliamentarian rather than king-centric, but so far this hasn't quite been possible because the public doesn't seem to be willing to vote for political parties. As of right now, only a quarter of the members of the House of Representatives belong to a political party, the rest being independent politicians. As such, introducing the rule that the largest political bloc forms the government would create quite a peculiar situation where independents stretching from militant Marxists to militant Islamists were the largest bloc. So for now, the plans for a more parliamentarian system are shelved. It should be noted that the judiciary in Jordan is both in theory and in practice separated from the other branches of government, and Jordan is the only Arab country where the right to a speedy trial is observed and long trial prison detainment becoming slowly a thing of the past. Alright, now let's get to my favorite part, civilization and society, or in less pompous language, how does one go about living in Jordan, an aspect quite important beyond what the laws say. As mentioned earlier, a significant chunk of the population is engaged in informal activities, particularly in the tourism sector, which has finally started to recover after taking a nosedive at the onset of the Syrian conflict. There are also quite a few people who don't appear in the statistics as working in the tourism sector, but whose work is predominantly tied to the sector. Such is the case with the public transport industry, which serves the tourists overwhelmingly. Because the country is almost entirely unrestricted, that is to say, there are no significant areas where your average pleb, including your average pleb tourist, can't safely go, this means that almost no corner of the country is left untouched by the tourists. Now, this may sound awful, but it really isn't. Quite the opposite. If there's one thing that both the elite and the average person wholeheartedly agree on, is the positive influence of Westerners roaming around essentially unchecked. Of course, the reasons differ, or at least used to differ at first. But regardless of the initial reasons, the presence of tourists means everyone encounters them every step of the way, which, according to a fine gentleman who helped me navigate the intricacies of the Jordan society, keeps the really bad ideas in check. He was referring, of course, to Marxism and militant Islamism. One can't really profess the benefits of economic Marxism given that more than 99% of the tourists come from distinctly non-Marxist countries. Same goes with hardline Islamism, which in addition to being illegal in Jordan is also hard to promote when almost every person in the country sees at least a few tourists having a good time while not exactly adhering to the strictest interpretations of Islam. Because make no mistake, in addition to Western tourists, other Arabs come here too, where alcohol is a lot less restricted, smoking is normative, an aspect which I absolutely loved and the main reason for which I'm looking forward to come back here, and where notions like the religious police are simply unheard of. The closest thing you notice as an average pleb that indicates this is not exactly a democracy is the presence of the tourist police, whose task is to protect the tourists from the locals. It sounds awful, but in practice, it really looks like the most boring job imaginable. For instance, over here at the ancient citadel in Amman, you can witness the harshest job that the tourist police conducts, running after tourists at about 5:30 p.m. to let them know that the site closes down at 6 p.m. Oh, and pet the cats. On a more serious note, living in Jordan is undoubtedly a lot more chill than in most of the rest of the area in terms of personal freedom, which includes cultural freedom as well. About 75% of the content in Arabic that exists on the internet originates from Jordan, which doesn't say much of the cultural involvement of the people of Jordan, but does say quite a lot of the lack of involvement in global culture by the people of other areas with sizable Arab-speaking populations. It seems that the free speech protections are indeed paying off. At the individual level, the economic policies described earlier are also noticeable. perhaps even more noticeable than they are in the statistics. Individual security helps a lot, Jordan being one of the few places in the Middle East, alongside Israel, where most people feel very secure to walk alone at night. This is important because summers get pretty hot, and as a result, most of the productive economic activities happen at night. In fact, during daytime, Amman is pretty deserted, no pun intended, when compared to what it looks like at midnight. Having access to those activities makes a huge difference in the de facto standard of living of the populace. For instance, I spoke with what is usually the poorest merchant group in any country, those that resell fish at the market. None of them knew or heard about anyone who wanted to work and couldn't find work. Now, that doesn't mean such cases don't exist, but it does mean that the official statistics are off the mark quite a bit. For instance, most cab drivers are officially unemployed, yet none of them is poor or on public assistance. In practice, as long as you don't require welfare, the government pretty much leaves you alone, which on one hand generates statistics that paint a worse situation than the reality, but on the other hand has slowly built up a middle class that can afford to finance culture and other activities that make Jordan a comparatively better place to live in. Officially, the minimum wage for all workers in Jordan is 110 Jordanian dinars, or $150 per month, before taxes. In reality, nobody makes less than $560 after taxes. Now, this may seem low, but considering the PPP factor, which is about 2.5 in Jordan, that means that on average, people live off on about 1,000 dinars, or $1,400 a month. In looking at this, one should exclude Aqaba and Petra, where both incomes and the PPP factors are significantly different, but those two areas encapsulate less than 2% of the populace. This makes Jordanians comparatively poor when put alongside their Saudi neighbors, but one has to remember that Jordan has to be judged by the standards of a non-oil country, and by that standard, Jordanians fare pretty well. It's far from perfect, of course, and it would help if the Aqaba model were to be extended, but if the recent past is to be any clue, the individual can expect things to get better slowly rather than at a fast pace, but also in a consistent manner. Naturally, this model doesn't satisfy everyone, but remember the recurring thread. Keeping the peace is significantly more important than economic or civilizational growth. This tendency to prioritize peace over other aspects has slowly seeped into the populace as well. One fine example of this is the outright refusal of most merchants to deal with women who don't speak Arabic. At first, I thought it's just that most people do run on a conservative interpretation of Islam. Well, as it turns out, that's rarely the case. What is the case a lot more often is that Western tourists complain to the police for quote-unquote harassment for what was, in fact, standard merchant practice in the Arab world, which indeed sometimes may feel like harassment by European standards, but it certainly isn't in an objective sense. As a result of that, many merchants have stopped dealing with women altogether and instead only approach men. Even female merchants do that too. And the practice spread fast because, well, it preserves the peace. Men, as it turned out, are a lot less likely to go to file complaints with the police because a merchant tried too hard to sell him something. Another story from this keeping the peace thread. When I was visiting the King Abdullah Mosque, from which you're seeing footage right now, there was another tourist there, a German chap, who was having a conversation with the imam. Naturally, I leaned closer to hear the conversation because that's what I do. And it turned out that the German guy was quite literally arguing with the imam, with the German guy being essentially an Islamist supporting lefty and with the imam being the voice of reason. I was enjoying the way the imam was knocking down the German guy's foolishness and calmly explaining to him that no, it's not the West that kickstarted the madness in the area, as the area has been fighting with itself for 1,000 years, and so on and so forth. But when the German guy became agitated, likely because of the astonishment of not finding any fans to his claptrap in here, the imam abruptly ended the conversation and calmly asked the German guy to get lost within 30 seconds, or else the security will forcibly escort him out. Later on, I asked the imam why did he do that, because the guy was basically a harmless fool, to which he replied, "Yes, but a fool nonetheless. Entertaining foolishness disturbs the peace. We live very well here. No need to rock the boat with such radicalism." I was then to encounter this attitude several times throughout my visit in Jordan, an attitude which I have not encountered in other Middle Eastern or Arab countries. This is surely something that warrants a lot more study than I was able to get in the week I spent in the kingdom. Although most people are clearly a lot more religious than Albanians, for instance, the other nominally Muslim-majority country covered during 2018, they are less religious than, say, Moroccans, which is something I will hopefully show towards the end of 2019, or indeed the Arabs in Israel. No place in Amman feels as religious as most of the Arab part of Jerusalem, for instance. What I'm trying to say is that Jordanians seem to have found a relatively balanced way of conduct, one that takes into account the religious concerns, but is also considerate of the much wider history of the place, including the Roman heritage, which is not neglected, and also considerate with the needs to have a modern country. Will this balance hold in the light of the new challenges? I don't know, but hopefully Freedom Alternative will be around for long enough to document this in a few years. Alright, so let me try some sort of a conclusion. Jordan sure does live up to the description of being the most liberal Arab country, a description which, upon on-the-field inspection, rather sells the place short in my opinion. Though I do understand why that phrasing is being used. If the elites play the hand really well, Jordan stands a great chance to become the model through which a non-oil country can reach full prosperity, and this can happen by 2030. This may not be self-evident while looking at the footage from the streets of Amman, but the numbers don't lie. And Jordan has an element of random in it, which, if coupled with a free economy, can generate plenty of pleasant surprises, something which has already happened on a small scale in Aqaba. If the elites resist the temptation to regulate that and the populace resists the poisoned fruit of Marxism and the stability that the country enjoyed so far is maintained, even in a worst-case scenario, the future would still be quite good. There are two reasons for which I hope this will be the case. One is because rich and free people are always preferable to poor and unfree people. The second, and perhaps the more important reason, is that if this experiment succeeds, then Jordan could become a very good example of good practice in the Muslim world, something which will help quite a lot with all of the Reformation efforts and the future arguments that will happen throughout this century. I don't claim to know all the answers, but if Jordan manages to keep its economics in order while maintaining the peace in the populace, then this will be a great victory over the long run for civilization itself, and not just in Jordan. I guess we'll see what happens. Hopefully at some point in the future I'll get to videotaping Aqaba as well, because there are plenty of interesting details there which I omitted from this video, not just due to time constraints, but also because without proper footage they're quite hard to explain and believe. So with that said, Jordan is much more than a place full of ancient sites to which tourists flock, and if things go well, we will hear a lot more about it in the next decade. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your continuous and generous support. Please do consider a donation should you derive any value from the work being done here. None of these come free by any stretch of the imagination. Please do subscribe to my social media, and I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.